So which World Eaters units are the current champions of Khorne, and which have Games Workshop not made suitably bloodthirsty? Let's talk through some of the strongest and weakest World Eaters units from the Codex. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where over the last week or so we've been talking World Eaters, and today I thought we'd do a breakdown of the strongest and weakest units in the book, and are perhaps more or less likely to make it into competitive lists. With that in mind, I've arranged the units in the Codex into 4 different tiers for how strong I think they are for the points right now. I will go through each of them in turn and talk about why I've ranked them where I have. Thanks to the World Eaters Discord for offering some insights on these as well. It was certainly helpful to get a bunch of other players' insights when putting the list together. First up, we'll start with Tier 4, some of the weakest units in the Codex in my opinion, and here I've chosen to rank the Predator tanks and the Defiler. I'd argue that the majority of vehicles in Codex World Eaters aren't particularly strong, though these two do seem kind of stand out bad. The Predator tanks are 130 to 140 points base, and are just kind of an inefficient shooting unit at the moment, despite their upgrades to Toughness 8 and Soul Shatter las cannons on the turret of the Annihilator. It kind of speaks volumes that Games Workshop cut the points cost for these guys quite a bit in their latest balance patch, giving them some free heavy bolter sponsons. The World Eaters units were already in print but not released at that point, so they missed out on these buffs. So basically these are some of the worst Predator tanks in Warhammer 40k right now. In general, having a bit of access to ranged firepower is quite nice for World Eaters lists, but it's not like it really plays into the main strength of the Codex, and they're likely to be a bit of a niche unit in the first place, never mind if they're inefficient too. The other unit that are ranked down here are the Defilers, 165 points base, and these guys really are in a very similar position to the Predators. The versions for the other Chaos Space Marine Legions got a boost in getting a bunch of free gear, even if their base points went up a touch. The World Eaters just completely missed out on that boost, and the Defiler remains just underwhelming compared with the other Demon engines, never mind the actual great units in the book. I guess it's a fairly fun model to use, you do get a bit of melee with it, plus it's got a fair few interesting guns, but for the current points cost it's not worth it. I think you could fairly easily take about 20 points off the unit, and it still might not be super great. Moving onwards and upwards though, here in Tier 3 we've got other units that I consider a bit overshadowed within the Codex, and perhaps to not too many people's surprise, again this is pretty much the entire vehicle pool of the Codex besides the Rhino. These I'd rate as better than the Defiler or the Predator, but still all have their own issues. First up, the Hellbrute is 105 points base. Again, like the previous two, it missed out on a bunch of free war gear that actually makes the Chaos Space Marine Hellbrute kind of efficient. You can make it into an okay core firepower platform, though it's not like World Eaters characters really want to sit around buffing it as opposed to getting charging into combat. And in terms of melee, it isn't the easiest to deliver, only with a movement of 6 inches. Compared with the Chaos Space Marine version as well, it misses the upgrades of Chaos Marks like the Zinch one to negate some damage, or potentially Fire Frenzy to return fire at the enemy army after they've shot you. Limited access to the generic Chaos stratagems has certainly hit this guy a bit. Next up, we've got the Chaos Land Raider. Kind of a bit disappointing how much this costs for what it does, as at least on paper, a lot of World Eaters units could quite happily use it to deliver them into combat. Admittedly, it does have Toughness 9 and big hitting las cannons, and if you did want to transport for Terminators or 8-bound, I guess you could use this. In reality, I feel like it's going to be played kind of rarely. As a transport, it costs really quite a lot. You're paying a lot for the premium of Toughness 9 and the good guns. In Warhammer 40k, it's often just not all that efficient to have a transport that costs far more than the unit it's transporting. Arguably, neither Terminators or 8-bound really want to transport. 8-bound move fast on their own, and Terminators can deep strike and have okayish durability as far as World Eaters go. And even in terms of toughness, the Land Raider has arguably taken a hit compared with earlier in the year. Recently, we had a Chaos Land Raider at Toughness 9 and a 2+ save with Armour of Contempt. Not having Armour of Contempt means that this thing just isn't quite as much a durable brick as it would have been with it. I'd say it's not unusable if you do want to pay a premium to make sure one unit gets into melee, and it is kind of handy to have a World Eaters unit that is just genuinely quite tough. But overall, I think it's still pointed a bit much. There's still the Land Raider issue that if you get tagged in combat with it as it moves forward, there's a good chance that you have your firepower all having to fire at the wrong things, which isn't great for it either. Next up, we've got the Forge Fiend, 140 points with the Plasma, an okay source of damage 3 shots, and in terms of ranged options within the Codex, I'd say it's perhaps one of the better ones, but maybe that's not saying all that much, admittedly. It's got okay toughness with the Demon Engine keyword, giving it regeneration and a 5+ invul. Not spectacular, but not bad. And again, I'd say the same for the damage output, to be honest. It's alright, but not really all that exciting. Overall, even if you do definitely want a little bit of range support, it might struggle to compete with things like allied demon skull cannons or allied wardog executioners, which provide kind of similar fire and are fairly fast and obsec too. Their Dinobot cousins, the Mauler Fiends, clock in at 140 points, and again, they're perhaps one of those units that's just kind of okay but not outstanding. Like the Forge Fiend, its durability is okay but not standout, and it's got alright melee against heavy hitters, though to be honest, compared with just about any other melee unit in this book, it still comes out a bit lacking. In reality, I think you're just going to be better off dealing damage with the various infantry choices rather than this. Finally, in this section, I've chosen to rank the Khorne Lord of Skulls here, 575 points. I'd say this one I've got a bit more time for, probably ranks towards the top of this section, though still I think a bit on the underwhelming side. It does have a really big hitting melee profile, it's got a couple of really good quality guns, and again it is interesting in World Eaters in particular, as it's a big tanky anvil unit in an army that's mainly quite easy to kill. It also does like those blood tithe buffs. Still though, despite all that, this thing really needs to be absolutely exceptional if you're going to play it for 575 points. Its toughness is okay, but if just about every anti-tank weapon on the board is going to be all focused at this guy, that's going to be bad news. And at that kind of points cost, he really does need to be removing big chunks of the enemy army from the board to make himself worth it, and even then he might come up lacking if he gets gunned down too early. I feel like most lists aren't going to have room for this guy just because of his enormous points cost, but in terms of his value I think he's not awful. Maybe competes a bit with Forge World choices like the Greater Brass Scorpion perhaps, at least in terms of raw numbers, that thing is quite nice. Moving onwards and upwards, and here in Tier 2 I'd rank these units as solidly usable, though I don't think that they're going to get taken by every army list, it might just be a bit more of a take or leave. First up here we have the Jackals at 7 points each. They're the Cornate cultists with a flurry of AP-1 melee if you get too close to them, and they do have their advantages, cheap for objectives and actions, and blood tithe points if they get killed. They've got objectives secured, the only source beside the actual Khorne Berserkers, and admittedly, for cultist type equivalents, if you do get close to them, they will hit you in melee rather hard. A whole bunch of attacks at AP-1 is rather good, and the Skull Smasher I think is really quite nice for a 5-point upgrade. The Dishonored does have a pretty reasonable chance of killing a Space Marine or two with that. I feel like perhaps their biggest issue though is that for their 70 points, they're just no tougher than standard cultists. I feel that is a bit annoying within the codex, seeing as you'd hope that the grunt troops would be some of the cheapest things that you could field, but even these guys get charged at a slightly higher cost due to their melee damage. Still though, I'd say not unusable, I'd field them in small units, maybe having one to hold a home field objective. A little bit more objective secured in the midfield isn't the worst though. Next up, we've got the World Eaters Terminators at 35 points each. They're potentially a big scary core unit with okay durability, a bit of range threat from those combi bolters and maybe combi melters and things if you upgrade, and you can put them in Warp Strike for free to get some positioning on the board where you need them. For downsides, they're perhaps a little bit slow, only moving 5 inches, and not having easy access to rhinos like the Berserkers have. And while their melee damage is pretty nasty given 4 attacks, and the fact that they're going to be there in numbers, compared with the Berserkers and the 8 bound, it's not actually amazing compared with the other very fighty World Eaters alternatives. As well as that, while their durability is better than most, I'd still say that they're not awesomely massively tough. Chaos Space Marine Terminators can make their toughness go absolutely obscene with things like the Black Rune of Damnation and psychic buffs from the Master of Possession. Khorne doesn't really care much for those kind of things though. The best you can get is a 6+ Feel No Pain and some defense against mortals on these. It's not nothing, but it's a far cry from what the generic Heretic Astartes can get. Overall, I feel like people are mainly going to be running Berserkers and 8 bound over these guys, though they definitely have their merits, including a bit of shooting and being a good target for core buffs and stratagems. Moving on, we've got Khan the Betrayer, 140 points, as the closest thing to a Footlord that you really get in this book. He hits in combat with heavy melee that's character protected, 10 attacks at strength 7, AP-4, and damage 3 most of the time. He is going to tear an absolute chunk out of elite infantry, and has at least a little bit of defense in return with his 4+ invul and 2+ save. It's maybe not terrible at escorting berserkers, put him in a rhino with some of them perhaps, and then when they get to melee they can use his reroll aura. He does have the unfortunate habit of having a chance of taking a big chunk out of them though in the fight phase. I say that Khan's usable enough, seeing as you can deliver him into combat quite easily, and his melee damage is pretty scary. 440 points though I would say is a bit on the overcosted side compared with the other characters. The melee is good but perhaps struggles to compete against some of the other good options in the Codex, and his damage buff for rerolling ones to wound is handy but a bit mediocre at this big points cost. I'd probably rank him towards the lower end of this tier, or maybe towards top of tier 3 if I was feeling a bit unkind to him. Finally, for the tier 2 units, we've got the Corn Lord on Juggernaut, 125 points, and he's one of the generic characters in the books that can actually take relics, or I guess the Warlord trait if for some reason you're not using either Angron or Lord Invocatus. I guess bonus to the Blood Tithe isn't the worst though. He gives a nice plus 2-inch movement boost to nearby units, which is probably the biggest reason to take him. If you've already got Lord Invocatus on the board, he could give that to another section of the army. 11-inch moving 8 bound or 8-inch moving Corn Berserkers is rather good. He's cheapish at 125 points, though I feel like the biggest issue with him is that his melee is a touch on the underwhelming side. Only AP minus 2 and strength 6 just isn't all that great on a Corn Lord when you've got so many other great options. I generally see this guy as a bit of a second pick after Lord Invocatus, as he seems easily worth it for the extra plus 35 points, his sword that ignores invul saves, his pre-game move, his fly ability, and his better armor all seem some pretty awesome upgrades compared with this guy for just that points cost. Moving on, we're getting into the really good stuff now. Here we've got tier 1, some of the strongest units in the codex, and just for a little bit more nuance, I've chosen to split it into a lower tier and a higher tier. I think that all of these units are really good and could easily appear in competitive World Eaters army lists, though I feel like a few of them are just a little bit more unequivocally great than others. First up, we've got the lower section, and we're starting with the Corn Berserkers, who would actually kind of rank somewhere between the two. I could have certainly been tempted to put them in the upper half of tier 1. Corn Berserkers are 22 points each and hit with a flurry of strength 6 attacks at AP minus 2, plus a rather nice Eviscerator for 5 points for a massive amount of strength 8 damage 2 hits. I've chosen to rank the Chaos Rhino alongside them, as they're basically going to be filled together really quite a lot. I don't really feel like it makes sense to rank either Corn Berserkers or Rhinos lower if most of the time you're going to be fielding the one in the other. In terms of damage, it is pretty standout against most targets, with that Eviscerator picking up the slack against heavier things. They've got excellent stratagem support, including fighting on death for just 1 CP, and taking an icon could give you the 3d6 drop the lowest charge, a bit more threat range there. They're also rather nice with their objectives secured to sit on objectives, and then they get a 6-inch heroic intervention stratagem again for 1 CP. It means they're pretty nice, very angry objective holders. Your opponent isn't going to be able to get on that objective without facing them in combat or killing them first. Their Blood Surge mechanic is the one where they get to move a little bit forward when you kill them in shooting. That one does have the potential to be very disruptive indeed, potentially meaning that you can't shoot them comfortably if you're too close to them, for fear of them suddenly jumping into combat with you and killing your shooting units. The combination of that, the heroic intervention, and fight on death stratagem means that it's just very hard to be in a good place against them if you're too close, perhaps forcing you to back off a bit. I typically want to deliver them by Rhino, maybe potentially putting a unit in strategic reserve to use the stratagem with the icon, and in general I think they're a unit that I'd certainly run some of, but probably not entire armies entirely full of them. I feel like things are best in a bit of a balance. Overall, they've got a whole load of good things going for them. The big downside though is that they're just really quite easy to kill for current Warhammer 40k. 22 points for a Space Marine stat line just isn't all that amazing. Things like heavy bolters or just about any other damage 2 weapon with at least some AP will cut through them very quickly indeed. Sometimes Blood Surge will help with that, but potentially sometimes not. Otherwise, for a solid HQ choice in the army, I've chosen to rank the Demon Prince here as well. He's 130 points base and 165 with the wings, which I would certainly take. That gives you a fast moving and hard hitting character choice, smashing the enemy with a whole bunch of big strength AP minus 3 and damage 3 attacks with that sword. And he actually does bring a bit of fun and pretty useful shooting to the table as well with that infernal cannon. I think he beats out the other couple of HQ choices that we ranked in the lower tier, and perhaps one of the most notable advantages of him is that he's quite a good choice to put a relic on, maybe the -1 to wound relic, or the one that allows you to buff a core unit. Theoretically, rerolls could be pretty nice for him as well, maybe getting him in combat next to 8 bound and amping up their obscene damage even more. Moving on, we get to the sheer might of the Red Angel himself. I've chosen to rank Angron here. I think he's certainly a top tier choice, though I'd argue that he's probably not in the upper half of top tier, as he does come with his own disadvantages. For whether or not Angron's good, I think it might depend a little bit on exactly what sort of games you're playing, and potentially what terrain you're playing on. The advantages of this guy are fairly obvious. He's fairly cheap for a Demon Primarch level character. He packs some obscene melee damage with 39 attacks at strength 10, Why not? It's very fast with a 16-inch movement, somewhat tough on his defensive profile, and then he's got a couple of really powerful tricks, respawning with the Blood Tithe, then just jumping back onto the board 9 inches away from the enemy, and potentially preventing fallback to some key enemy units, ideally chopping up an enemy unit, consolidating into the next, and then keeping them in combat for him to kill in their turn. If he gets going against the right list, I feel like he could absolutely just demolish it over the course of a game. He likely would need to keep the blood tithe flowing though, as he's going to be a unit that will get killed if he gets exposed to any significant amount of damage. On the negative side, if he's just throwing himself at the enemy army, he's probably going to be hit back by the full brunt of everything they have to bear. He probably will die to that, and even in earlier terms of the game, he can't hide behind obscuring terrain like other things due to 18 wounds, and that means that big anti-tank guns could take chunks out of him before he even gets to melee. If you're using him, he might potentially eat a whole bunch of blood tithe points, you might not get round to maxing out the other abilities by the time the game ends, and despite his ludicrous melee profile, he does have some hard counters, things like damage caps on units like Abaddon or Catan for example. I'd say perhaps the biggest reason not to use him though is to potentially take advantage of Lord Invocatus' Warlord trait. If Angron's in the army, he has to be the Warlord, and that means that you can't have Lord Invocatus scout moving some big scary 8-bound threats into the midboard and getting horrendous first turn charges. I feel like most lists would either want the one or the other, and a lot of people would prefer the big movement charges rather than a respawning Red Angel. Despite those downsides though, I feel like he is going to be extra good in certain games, ridiculously powerful in small games to the extent where he's probably going to be a bit overpowered. The big blood tithe ability just might be something that the enemy really can't handle because they don't have the raw damage output to hit him back. And if you do happen to be playing with some enormous buildings that can actually shield him from the brunt of enemy shooting, maybe some big tournament L-shaped ruins, that is going to make his life a lot easier and the opponents a lot harder. Overall, I'd rate him as pretty great, but not 100% auto-include for every list, mainly due to Lord Invocatus. Finally, we've got another HQ choice in the Master of Executions, 65 points, and I feel like these guys might not be the single most exciting or talked about unit in Codex World Eaters, but for the 65 points they bring some pretty respectable numbers to the table. On the charge they get a massive 7 attacks at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 2, with a chance for mortal wounds on 6s, and for 65 points on a big character threat like that, perhaps jumping outside a Rhino with some Berserkers perhaps, I feel like for 65 points you're getting a really good deal there. Otherwise he's got a few other nice benefits, a massive great big heroic intervention with warp-sighted Butcher, plus a trophy taker rule to allow him to reroll against characters, potentially making him an extra good assassin. Even if he charges in, deals some melee and dies, then for 65 points that's one of the most efficient blood tithe units in the book as well. Even if he's a one-hit wonder, then it furthers your army-wide special rules after that. Maybe he doesn't feel like the single most necessary character in the book, but I feel like one or two of these in spare HQ slots is a pretty reasonable add-in. Finally, getting into some of the scariest and most efficient stuff in the Codex, we have the upper half of Tier 1, hopefully some of the units that will please Khorne the most in this book. First up, we perhaps have the slightly less flashy but incredibly efficient Chaos Spawn, 25 points for a single model in the fast attack choice. Typically, I'd be tempted to max out my fast attack slots with single ones of these. Between what they actually do on the board and generating blood tithe points for super cheap, I feel like you really just cannot go wrong with them. Even if you paid just 75 points for the 3 of them and you started the game with 3 blood tithe points if they died instantly, it'll basically unlock you an army-wide special rule for the rest of the army like +1 to charge or something, or do most of the work to getting one of the really quite nice ones like the 6+ feel no pain or one of the damage boosts. In reality they kind of do so much more than that. In World Eaters with the extra attack and the extra strength their melee is pretty threatening for the cost. They're not as slow as most units, with a 7-inch move, a little bit quicker than the standard Khorne Berserkers. They're also somewhat durable for the cost as well, with 4 wounds at toughness 5 on just a 25-point model, and that particularly annoying special rule where if the opponent just fails to kill them, they ping back to full health again. Just having individual, really quite small cheap units is just a great asset to 40k forces in the first place as well. They can screen out enemy units or hold down objectives for super cheap, or potentially even trade out well with enemy units, maybe forcing an enemy unit to have to try and charge them and kill them, and then set them up for your own berserkers to charge them in return. I feel like 1 or 2 individual ones of these is pretty tempting for other Chaos armies. In World Eaters though, getting the blood tithe points for when they die just means that it takes them to the next level, fairly efficient as units, and thoroughly efficient once their deaths have unlocked you an army-wide boost. Moving on, we've got both flavours of the rather terrifying World Eaters possessed, the brutal 8-bound, perhaps being some of the premier frontline damage dealers of the Codex, maybe alongside Khorne Berserkers. These guys are fast at 9 inches, get pretty crazy damage outputs with a ridiculous amount of high strength, high AP damage to attacks, plus a champion with the Lacerators for damage 3. There's not a lot in the game that really wants to be charged by them, and if you did need yet more damage output, they've got access to Red Butchers or the Mortal Wound stratagem to layer on more hurt. They're a core unit, and perhaps one of the best units for focal buffs and things. Character auras or Angron rerolls could affect them, and perhaps most importantly, Lord Invocators could give them an extra 2-inch movement, and if he's the Warlord, give them a big pre-game move as well, zooming them up the board for first turn charges. They do have their strategic reserve thing where they can come in from reserve round 1. I do kind of feel that might be a bit of a trap though. I feel like most of the time what's going to happen with that is you just turn up on the enemy's flanks, fail the charge because it's a 9-inch charge and you don't have the Berserker icon stratagem, and then have a rather expensive unit just hanging out in the wind, and the opponent will almost certainly focus some big damage on them the next turn. The individual models are reasonably tough, but for 40 points it's just really not that impressive. I think you're far better off scout moving them, or just having them jump from terrain to terrain. They've got rather a large threat range, and if you can try and get them into some sort of line of sight blocking terrain in the midfield, then they'll be able to threaten a bunch of the board. Overall, very, very strong. Feel like Games Workshop probably wanted to sell some of these kits. As well as in standard World Eaters, they have even more relevance in the Disciples of the Red Angel formation. They get objectives secured and a few other supporting stratagems like the one to jump on enemies trying to fall back from combat. Then, and if one flavour of 8-bound weren't enough for you, I'd also rank the Exalted 8-bound here. I feel like Games Workshop have done quite well to make these guys pretty much equally scary and a very viable alternative for the standard ones. The main advantage to these guys is that they just have slightly better raw stats overall. Rather than a 5 plus invul save, they get a 4 plus invul save, which I think does outweigh the slightly more increased cost. 4 plus invuls are great, and their melee damage is just a bit more general purpose. The standard 8-bound might be given a bit of a pause by things like heavy vehicles, but these guys will just absolutely maul through them with those chain fists hitting at a massive strength 10. They also get a rather nice no fallback ability, a 4 plus chance to keep the enemy in combat. Again, that can be absolutely game changing, just as it can be with Angron. Kill something, pile into something else, and potentially save them from any enemy guns next turn, as the thing that they're in combat with can't run away. Their biggest downside compared with the standard 8-bound is that they're not core, but it means that they can operate a bit more independently and don't need to worry about going around with characters for movement buffs or whatever. They'll just do what they do. They also have the option to deep strike if you'd like to as well. Maybe not the worst thing in the world for later turns in the game. You might have triggered the +1 to charge buff by then. That plus a reroll at least gives them some chance of making the charge, around about 66% if you can budget a CP reroll. Overall, these guys are enormously massively scary as well. A 4 plus invul, big hitting chain fist, and the ability to keep enemy in combat all are great. Finally, lastly, and perhaps for competitive World Eaters lists, one of the single best. Here we have Lord Invocators at 160 points, a unique HQ choice with a big demon riding a flying juggernaut that's borne aloft on tongues of fire. And for this guy, in any sort of optimized World Eaters list, if you're not running Angron, I would absolutely certainly run him. As we mentioned a couple of times already, the Warlord trait that he gets allows you to scout move with him as well as 2 other core units that are nearby to him. My guess would usually be that that's normally going to be a couple of units of standard 8-bound. Due to the movement boost, those guys will get to move 11 inches and he'll get to move 12 with his big movement characteristic and fly. And that way you've just put 3 enormous melee threats right in the midfield, and they do have the movement that should allow them to get first turn charges if your opponent is deployed anywhere near the front of their drop zone. If you don't get first turn, the pre-game move is still a big win. Even just getting them into some sort of midfield cover where they're going to be safe is going to be a big deal, and then launch an assault in your turn 1 from there. Overall, I think that's just a solid enough selling point just then and there. It's got a decent enough melee and defensive stat line as well, with a 2 plus save, and his Coward's Bane axe is damage to and ignores invuls, rarely a bad thing for fighting enemy characters perhaps. And as mentioned, his fly plus 12-inch movement means he's going to get where he needs to. He isn't going to be a unit that you're generally going to be able to ignore. Overall, really solid. My initial impressions are that both him and Angron will be at least usable for strong World Eaters lists. I suspect we're going to see some of both do well. Seems like most people's initial takes is that this guy with the scout move might overall be stronger on most tables where you can't hide Angron and things. I guess we'll see how well that meets up with reality though. Respawning Angron all game long is still monstrously powerful, and I wouldn't want to diminish that. So anyway, let me know what you make of the new World Eaters units. Which ones do you think are going to be strongest and weakest, and why? Looking forward to hearing any alternate takes down in the comments below. I'm sure we can cover a few top World Eaters army lists when a few people get them going. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular videos coming, including plenty of 40k stuff just about every day. I'll be hoping to make a bunch more World Eaters videos as well, a few more focused reviews for the new units. If you'd like another video to watch on competitive World Eaters, then I'll link my video to Corn Berserkers down in the video description, a fair few thoughts on fielding them effectively in game. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page too, and you can find that one linked down in the video description below. Making all these videos does take a fair amount of time and effort, and if you are enjoying quite a bit, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.